In this section, I will look at the Shadow Copy service. The Shadow Copy service works with your regular backups to provide additional restore options that the users can access without having to go through your help desk. The Shadow Copy service works by taking a snapshot of your data according to a schedule. The advantage of this over a regular backup is that you can run shadow copies when users are most likely to be changing or adding files. With traditional backups, the backup is usually run overnight. If the user were to accidentally delete a file during the day that was created that day, the file would be lost because the backup had not run yet. Shadow copies are very fast because they only save changes and work at the block level. When a file is first saved or modified, the Shadow Copy service needs to take a complete copy of the file. The file is copied to the Shadow Copy area. This can be an area on the same hard drive as the files, or a completely separate hard drive dedicated to shadow copies. Once there is a complete copy of the file in the Shadow Copy area, only changes need to be saved into the Shadow Copy area. When other files are modified or created in the file system, these files are also copied to the Shadow Copy area. Shadow copies use a first-in, first-out system. As soon as the Shadow Copy area is full, the oldest file in the Shadow Copy area gets removed to allow for new files. The more hard drive space you allocate for shadow copies, the more revisions of each file you can store. Shadow copies were first introduced in Windows Server 2003. In Windows Server 2003, shadow copies only worked on the share level. With Windows Server 2008, shadow copies now work on the volume level. There are a number of different ways that you can get into the settings to configure shadow copies. One method is to open Windows Explorer and then go to the hard drive you want to configure shadow copies for, right-clicking on it, and then selecting the option Configure Shadow Copies. You can also access shadow copies by selecting Properties for the hard drive. If you go into the Properties for the hard drive, all you need to do is select the tab Shadow Copies to access the settings for shadow copies. From Shadow Copy Configuration, you could select the option Enable to enable shadow copies. However, it is best that you do not enable shadow copies until you have configured it by pressing the button Settings. This is because once you enable shadow copies, there are some settings you cannot change unless you disable shadow copies and in the process delete any existing shadow copies. If I now go into the Settings section, first I can set which hard drive the shadow copies will be stored on. For best performance, you should always store the shadow copies on their own hard disk. If you're using a dedicated hard disk, you may want to consider setting the maximum size for the shadow copies to no limit. In this particular case, the shadow copies are sharing the C drive with the operating system. So therefore, I will set a limit on how much hard drive space the shadow copies can use. Without a limit on the amount of hard drive space shadow copies can use, shadow copies will use all the free space on the hard drive and may cause problems with other services on the computer. How often shadow copies run is determined by a schedule. To access the schedule, press the Schedule button, and you'll see by default 2 shadow copies will be run Monday through Friday twice a day. If I want to add additional schedules, I can do this by pressing the New button. Once the schedule has been added, I can adjust the start time below. How often you run the Shadow Copy service on your server really depends on how much data is changing on your server. For a server with a lot of hard disk IOs, for example, if you are running a database server, it is not recommended to schedule a lot of shadow copies, as this will reduce the performance of the server. If, however, you are running a file server on which there are a lot of files which do not change often, and files are being added quite regularly, I would recommend running more shadow copies. Remember that if a user creates and deletes the file and the shadow copy service has not run, the file is lost forever. If I now accept these 2 dialogues and go back to the Properties for shadow copies, you will notice that the Enable button is grayed out. Remember this important fact when configuring settings for shadow copies. When you change the settings for shadow copies are automatically enabled. If I press the button Create Now, the Shadow Copy service will create a snapshot for use with the Shadow Copy service. To demonstrate Shadow Copies better, I will navigate to the Documents folder. You will see that I have created 2 files. If I open the data file, you will notice that it has the text Original, which I will now change to Modified. The second file I have called Delete Me. Before I can delete the file, it needs to be modified. Once it is modified, the Shadow Copy service will take a copy of it next time it runs. Now that changes have been made to the hard drive, the Shadow Copy service needs to run again to record the changes that have been made. I could wait for the next scheduled Shadow Copy to run, but I will instead go into Shadow Copies and run another manual Shadow Copy. Once the Shadow Copy is complete, I will remove the file Delete Me to demonstrate how Shadow Copies can retrieve files that have been deleted from the hard disk. Remember, unless a file is created or modified between runs of the Shadow Copy, it will not be copied by the Shadow Copy. If you had a file on your server that had not been modified for some time, since Shadow Copies use a first-in, first-out system, it will most likely no longer have a copy of the file. You can see why Shadow Copies are not a replacement for regular backups. Once the Shadow Copy is complete, I can now go into Windows Explorer and right-click on the file and select the option Previous Versions. If I select the button down at the bottom, Open, you can see what is contained in the file. You can see here that it is the original version of the file. However, this is a read-only copy. If I do not wish to overwrite the original file, I can select the option Copy. If I am 100% sure that I want to restore the file, I can select the option Restore, which will restore this version of the file over the original one. To restore the deleted file, there is no file that I can right-click on and use Restore Previous Versions. To restore the deleted file, I need to instead right-click on the folder and select the option Restore Previous Versions. If I select Open, I can see all the files that were saved with that restore point. The snapshot of the previous version appears as read-only files in Windows Explorer. As you can see, I can move the Previous Versions window down to show the other Explorer window and then drag and drop the deleted file from one window to the other. It's important to note here that if I had deleted the file by sending it to the recycle bin, it would not appear in Previous Versions, but I could, however, restore the file from the recycle bin. This concludes Shadow Copies. As you can see, Shadow Copies are easy to set up and use. Since Shadow Copies are block-based, they are very fast, but are subject to disk tools like defragmentation. Also, Shadow Copies are not a good choice for hard drives with high I/O, for example, database servers. Shadow Copies are a better choice for file servers. The more space you allocate for Shadow Copies means having more revisions you can store on your server. But remember, Shadow Copies are not a replacement for regular backups. Set up correctly, Shadow Copies can help take some of the burden off administrators by allowing end users to restore their own files.